Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Quest 79 talk on sharks and marine conservation. My name is Greg Holder, and I'm honored to be one of the inner gold guides for this amazing day. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit more about myself before we get on to the main topic of sharks and marine conservation. So I started diving around 8 years ago now. I was a personal trainer in London before that. Well, I was a personal trainer once I started diving as well. But as soon as I started diving, that very first dive I ever went on, I just fell in love with the underwater world. I was just fascinated by it. It was something so beautiful and so interesting. I straight away was just obsessed. So for the next few years, I worked really hard to go on holiday as often as I could in order to go diving at any opportunity. And after a few years of this, I realized that why was I always working so hard to go on holiday to do what I loved? Why couldn't I just make that my life, my career? And that was when I left my job in London and went to pursue a career with the ocean as my office. So I trained up as a scuba dive instructor, worked as a scuba diver for a while. And since then, in the last 3 or so years, I've been lucky enough to work not only for scuba or dive centers, but also in a shark conservation organization in South Africa, where I was lucky enough to dive with many different shark species while I was also educating interns on shark anatomy, biology, and obviously mainly conservation. And we had lots of school groups coming through, learning and sort of understanding more about sharks because they have such a bad reputation. So that is a little bit about me. I've been lucky enough to dive with a number of different shark species. The largest shark species in the world, the whale shark, I've snorkeled with a number of times, but then I've also seen a number of smaller species, the smallest being an epaulet shark, which is only about 80 centimeters long. So I've had lots of different experiences with these amazing animals. And every time I've dived with them, I've fallen more and more in love with them. And the more I learn about them, the more I realized that we need to do more to protect them and understand these animals, which is what this talk is about today. So what do I want you guys to get out of today's talk? Well, mainly, I want you to understand that sharks are vital to the marine environment. They're not the monsters that a lot of people think that they are, and also that they are in urgent need of our protection and our compassion and our care. And the main thing I want everyone to come out of today's talk with is the idea that you as an individual can make an impact. So every single person watching this talk can make an impact in their small daily decisions and your daily life. You can make small changes which do make big differences on a big scale. So first of all, let's all get on the same level playing field when we understand what a shark is. So a shark is a fish, as most of you will already know, but they are quite different from most of the other fish as they have a cartilage skeleton. Now, only sharks and rays have this cartilage skeleton. All other fish have a sort of a hard, bony skeleton, more similar to our skeletons. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize about sharks is that there are so many different species. If you were to ask, a general person how many species of sharks there are, or even name them, people would maybe be able to name 3 or 4, maybe think there was 15 or 20 shark species max. But actually there's over 500 different species of sharks in the ocean. And in fact, we're discovering new sharks every year. So there's likely to be much more than 500 species, but there's 500 or more than 500 known species of sharks. And they vary massively in where they live. Some live in shallow waters, some live in really deep oceans, some even live in rivers and specialize in fresh water. Some are huge, like I said, the whale shark, which can grow up to around 18, maybe 20 meters long. And then there's tiny sharks, like the dwarf lantern shark, which literally only reaches about 20 centimeters long, full grown, smaller than your average ruler. So they're really, really varied species, and we can't see them as just this sort of one generic species, which obviously everybody does. When you say shark, pretty much everyone is going to picture a great white shark, and that is just one of 500 species, of all of which are very, very different. And one of the most amazing things about sharks is how long they have been around on the planet being top predators. They have been around for over 400 million years. That's over 150 million years before the dinosaurs were even walking on the earth. Sharks were even in our oceans before we had trees on land. And just to put that in perspective, humans have only been around sort of a maximum of around a few 100,000 years, depending on what you consider to be like the start of humanity. But really, we have been around for just a split second compared to how long sharks have been around on the earth, playing these key, important top predatory function, which we're going to learn a little bit more about in a second. So some other really important details that we need to understand about sharks is their life history and what makes them so vulnerable to decline, because they're very different from many other fish species, which are more resilient to fishing pressures, even though we'll talk about general fishing later on in the talk. But in general, certain fish species can be quite resilient to a certain amount of fishing pressure, where sharks generally aren't. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, they're very slow growing. So they take a very long time to reach sexual maturity. So for example, if we use a bull shark, for example, which is sort of a middle of the range shark in terms of lifespan, bull sharks live to around 50 years old, but they only reach sexual maturity at around 21 to 23 years old. So nearly half of their lifetime is spent growing up to sexual maturity. So this obviously means that if we are hunting or killing sharks, or sharks are being killed through any means, it's very likely that a lot of the sharks that are killed haven't actually reached sexual maturity yet, and therefore haven't had a chance to reproduce. And, it doesn't take complicated maths to understand that if we are killing animals before they've had a chance to reproduce, it's going to be a declining number. We have to at least allow animals to reproduce and, make offspring before we kill them, even though ideally we don't kill them. But to keep, population numbers stable, we must allow these animals to reproduce to keep their numbers nice and stable and nice and strong. And another thing that makes sharks particularly vulnerable is that when they do reproduce, because of their different life history characteristics, they actually have very few young, up to max around, I think, 80. Some shark species have over 100 pups. But even then, if we look at that compared to fish regularly lay thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands. The mola even releases millions of eggs in each reproductive cycle, where sharks only have up to about 100, but most sharks only have 10, 20, up to 50 pups that go. Some sharks as low as just 1 or 2. And they also have years break in between these reproductive cycles because they use internal fertilization. They actually grow the pups inside them a lot of the time. It takes a lot of energy, and therefore they have to take years off between pregnancies. So this again makes them very vulnerable because they're not reproducing very, very fast. So they're not very quick to recover from a decline. If we reduce a number of shark species in an area, they take a very, very long time to slowly recover their numbers. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, sharks are top ocean predators, and they are considered a keystone species, which means that they have a disproportionate effect on the rest of the ecosystem in compared to their actual numbers. So even though there are a lot more other fish in the ocean, and sharks in actual numbers are much smaller numbers than many, many other fish species you'll see, the sharks that are there have a much bigger impact on the rest of the ecosystem, which is why they're just so important to ecosystems and why we must have them there. Now, why are they keystone species? Well, for one, they maintain species biodiversity. Basically, they hunt the most populous fish in an area. So they don't let any one species overpopulate and take over an area and therefore have a reduced biodiversity in that area. If there's one fish that is reproducing much faster, much more successfully than other fish, those sharks will be hunting those fish, and therefore they'll stop their numbers getting out of control. And that allows for many, many other species to still survive and continue. So they maintain a really nice high biodiversity in the ecosystem that sharks live, whether it's on the reef or in the open ocean or in the deep oceans. And then also sharks remove dying or unhealthy or ill fish from the population by hunting and killing them. And this actually reduces the spread of diseases around a population in an ecosystem, which obviously is very, very good for the health of the ecosystem. And to understand how important this is to us as humans who live on land, actually the oceans are vitally important for our own survival on land. They produce more than half of all the oxygen we breathe. I know forests and jungles are always credited for being the lungs of the planet, which they are, but they're only sort of one lung of the planet. That other lung is the ocean. So without that, we wouldn't have nearly enough oxygen on our planet to survive. They also absorb a lot of the carbon dioxide we produce, and vitally, they store or absorb a huge amount of heat coming from a lot of our activities creating heat by burning fossil fuels and things like that. So again, without healthy oceans, there's just no way that we would have a healthy land ecosystem. So really, we must protect the oceans and therefore protect sharks in order to continue surviving on this planet. So we're going to watch a quick video now showing you how a keystone species, now this video shows wolves as the example, but sharks have a very similar function in the ocean, how a keystone species can impact so many different species and the whole ecosystem around it.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transform not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, so now you've watched that video, you get a bit of an idea of how important sharks are to the whole ecosystem. So a lot of animals that we know are really important, such as wolves, generally get quite a lot of protection. Wolves are protected in quite a few places around the world, even though they are still hunted and killed in certain areas, but generally their protection is increasing as we learn more about their importance. But sharks don't seem to get the same level of protection. Why is this? This is because there is such a huge amount of misunderstanding and fear that surrounds sharks and, the stories that we tell about sharks. If you say the word shark to people and ask them what word they come up with, they will almost always, or the vast majority of them, will say jaws, will say fear, or scary, or bite, or attack. We relate all these sort of scary emotions to sharks, and that's because of the media, whether it's newspapers or films. Generally, the only information that the average person gets about sharks is either when there's a scary shark film come out, like Jaws or like The Meg or any of these other films that are designed to scare you and sort of thrill you, or there's news in newspaper articles, whatever, about when a shark's come into a bay, there will be a big headline saying man-eating shark scares humans out of water, or whatever it might say. Or obviously when there is the very, very rare shark encounter where a shark unfortunately does bite a human, again, it'll be up in the headlines, making really, really big news about it. And so this is the only information that most people have to go on, and therefore it makes sharks sound extremely dangerous. But in fact, this is all just to sell the newspapers or to sell movies. And in fact, this really doesn't tell the whole story, as there are millions and millions of, not instances, of occurrences when sharks and humans are in the water at the same time, and there's absolutely nothing happens because sharks don't see humans as food. And it's only that 1 in a million, 1 in 100 million chance when a shark does unfortunately mistake a human for a food source or something else, where they come in and bite, that reaches the news. So we really must change our outlook on sharks and understand that the news that hits the headlines is that very, very 1 in a million sort of encounter, and actually the vast majority of encounters, whether it's known by diving or snorkeling with sharks, or whether unknown by just swimming around in the ocean and there being sharks in that bit of ocean at the same time, end with absolutely no drama or no sort of negative encounter. So another really important factor to understand when we talk about sharks, and this is the same for all fish, is that we don't link any emotion with sharks or fish. And I think one of the main reasons is that they don't make any noise. Also, they don't give any emotion or sort of expression on their face. We judge emotions either by the noise that someone makes. If I stub my toe on a table, I'm going to say ow. If I drop that table on my toe, I'm going to scream out in pain, and you're also going to see the pain in my face. Where sharks, and like I said, all fish, they don't have this ability to, they don't make noise out of water. They do make noises underwater, but it's a very different way, and we don't hear them, and they don't have the facial muscles to make any expressions. So therefore we link fish and sharks with feeling no pain. And in fact, that's completely wrong. And there's been numerous hundreds of studies, and it's very, very, very well accepted now that sharks and fish do all feel pain in very much the same way that mammals and birds do. So we need to start treating them the same as we do with animals, sentient mammals that feel pain and that have protection from cruelty and from experiencing any sort of pain. So we need to really start overriding this sort of automatic sense. Because we don't hear any noise and don't see any emotion on the animal, we have to override that automated sort of assumption that they're not feeling pain and remind ourselves that they do have exactly the same capacity to feel pain as humans do and as other mammals do. So, if we hook a fish on a hook, imagine any other animal, a puppy or a pig, having a hook put through its cheek. It's going to be experiencing pain. It's going to be making a lot of noise and it's going to be very distressing. But because we can't hear this noise and see that emotion on fish, we just sort of assume they're not feeling it. So we must start changing that mindset of fish not feeling pain. We must remember that fish and sharks do feel pain in very much the same way. So I'm obviously talking about why we should protect sharks and what's so good about them, but how dangerous actually are sharks? And I mentioned this briefly in a previous slide, and I said that sharks really are not nearly as dangerous as most people think. There are only around 6 to 10 on average fatalities from shark bites a year. 2019 only saw 2 around the whole world. Now, if sharks saw humans as a prey source, it's scary to think of, because there would be hundreds of attacks every month, because there are so many people in the oceans. It would be genuinely really dangerous to go and swim in the ocean if sharks genuinely saw us as a source of food. So just by looking at this number, and such a low number, it proves that sharks really do not see us as a food source. And these very, very occasional instances are actually, as I mentioned, a mistaken identity, or sort of basically an accident that has obviously had a very unfortunate consequence. And actually, once you actually see a shark in the ocean, if you're ever lucky enough to go diving or even go snorkeling with sharks around, you'll see that generally they are very, very cautious of humans. And in fact, will swim away from you as soon as they see you, really, especially if you make a sudden movement towards them. They don't understand what we are. They don't see us as a prey source, and they're not sure if maybe we're even a predator to them or some other dangerous animal. So they generally stay well clear of humans, which is why on a dive, for example, it's such a thrill to see a shark, because generally it's quite quick, fleeting glimpse, because they're off and out of view as soon as humans come too close to them. So next, we're going to watch a video really showing you how sharks actually do behave underwater. This is an incredible video with Christina Zanato. It was showed on BBC a few years back for their Blue Planet Live series. And it really is an incredible experience just to show you how intelligent, sensitive, and thoughtful sharks are. Obviously, remember, this is a very, very unique situation with someone who is highly, highly trained in handling sharks, but it still just gets you thinking about how the movies and the newspapers portray sharks as just swimming around waiting to see a human and wanting to bite a human as soon as they see them. You see that sharks actually have a very, very different mentality. All right, so now you've seen that video, hopefully you're starting to see that sharks really aren't this mindless, aggressive animal. They are top predators in the ocean, of course, but again, they don't see us as a food source. And the only reason those sharks were hanging around so much in that video was because there was a food source in the area. Christina Zanato had that box or tin of food with her, so the sharks could smell that, so they wanted to stay around. But there's also an argument that maybe the sharks recognized Christina Zanato, know that she's either going to feed them, or, as you saw, they're going to get a bit of a stroke, which possibly they enjoy. So these questions are just here for you to quickly look at and just really get you thinking about what you saw in that video. Do the sharks have a chance to bite Christina in that video? Quite obviously, any of them could have bitten her at any point. They were very, very close, but they didn't. Are they aggressive? Do they look like aggressive, angry animals? Definitely not. They're very calm, very graceful animals in the water. Are they able to make decisions? You saw Christina saying that she doesn't control them. They decide when to come in and when to leave. And also possibly, are they feeling emotion in this encounter? It looks like they're making decisions to stay around with Christina even when she's not feeding them. So are they getting some extra benefit from this encounter above and beyond sort of just food? All right, so now we get on to the more depressing, but unfortunately realistic part of the presentation, which is talking about shark numbers and shark conservation. So sharks are in decline around the world. Almost every shark species is seeing quite a rapid decline due to a number of different issues, which we're going to talk about next. Some species have reduced in numbers by up to 99% in just the last 100 years. You know, that's pretty easy math. That's roughly 1% every single year. So, you know, we're looking at the possible extinction of this species in the next few years if things don't change. And that's the oceanic whitetip, that species that has reduced by 99%. But then a recent study that was literally released in 2022 showed that they looked at around 23 different species of oceanic shark and ray, and they found that all of those species have seen a massive decline of up to 71% in their numbers in just the last 50 years. So that's even faster than 1% a year. So again, really looking at scary numbers and looking at serious extinction of a number of these different species. And to put a rough number on it, not that anyone knows because there's so much black market trade of sharks and so many sharks killed and then thrown back in the ocean without being reported. It really, no one knows how many sharks are killed every year, but to put a rough number estimate on it, it is thought that around or at least 100 million sharks are killed every single year. 100 million sharks. That is something like 22,000 sharks every single hour of every day throughout the whole year. And that is just an unimaginable number, and it's quite incredible that there are even sharks still left in the ocean today. But they're reducing very, very quickly. So we must start working hard to protect these animals and change laws, change practices to allow these species not to go into extinction, because not only will that be a devastating just for general biodiversity, and you know, it's always sad if an animal goes extinct, but it's going to have dire consequences for the ecosystems in the ocean and therefore ecosystems on land. So what are the main threats facing sharks? Well, the first one that I'm going to go over quite quickly, because a lot of people sort of know a bit about it, but it's also very, very hard to address this problem unless you are in Asia or directly involved in it, and that is the act of shark finning. So that is bringing a shark up on board, you know, in a net or on a hook, chopping its fins off, and then throwing that shark back in the ocean, usually still alive, but to die a very slow and painful death, either by sinking to the bottom of the ocean or being attacked by other animals or basically bleeding to death. So this, not only is this cruel, obviously, because we know that sharks feel pain. We've looked at that. We saw that video. Sharks feel pain. They are intelligent. They think they have emotions, but also it wastes 90% of the shark. So even if killing sharks wasn't such a bad thing, it would still be wasting 90%, which is pretty awful anyway, even though any shark killing is pretty devastating and, you know, not good with current shark populations. And this shark fin that is cut off the shark is used for a delicacy in Asian cuisine called shark fin soup. Now, this shark fin soup is served as I said, a delicacy or as a special meal at banquets and at weddings as a sign of luck and prosperity. Now, this shark fin doesn't actually add any flavor or nutrition to the soup. It is just there to give it that name of shark fin soup, to give it that status symbol. So it really is a completely pointless activity, and it is, you know, killing millions, possibly hundreds of millions of sharks every single year. But as I mentioned, that's quite hard to impact that industry. But if you ever do see a Chinese restaurant that sells, or any Asian restaurant that sells shark fin soup, please don't support that restaurant. Maybe even go and tell them why you're not supporting them. But again, if you've never experienced it, never involved in it, it's very hard to affect the shark fin industry unless you're signing petitions. The next thing we can definitely, on an individual level, impact, and that is the global fishing industry. So this is a quote from the recent study that I quoted earlier, and they found that as I mentioned, that there was a 71% decline in those oceanic species, and they put that down to an 18-fold increase in relative fishing pressure since the 1970s. So it means that the fishing pressure on sharks and other fish has increased by 18 times in just 50 years. And this is why these sharks and also many, many other fish cannot keep up with the hunt. They cannot reproduce fast enough compared to how quickly they're being taken out of the ocean. And if we quickly look at that graph in the bottom corner there, you can see in the 1950s, we were catching, when I say we, as in a human race as a whole, the fishing industry was catching around 20 million tons of fish every single year. Now, this is a huge number, but relatively it was sustainable. You know, that was done in a way that allowed fish to reproduce, and it wasn't too damaging to most fish populations. However, with the invention of refrigeration on ships, bigger, stronger nets, more mechanized, larger ships, the fishing industry grew, and their ability to catch huge amounts of fish grew exponentially. And in just 30 years or so, it went up from 20 million to nearly 100 million tons of fish every single year. And you'll see that since the 1990s, that number hasn't really increased very much. And that's not because the fishing industry hasn't continued to grow and hasn't continued to try harder and harder to catch more fish. It's actually just that it's physically impossible to catch more fish because there's just less and less fish to catch at the same time. So we're trying harder and putting more effort in to catch less fish per boat and per hour fished, which is why we're just sort of maintaining a steady amount of catch at about just under 100 million tons. But we are literally emptying the oceans at this speed. If we continue at this level with over half of all fisheries being overexploited, therefore having the fish numbers and the fish species reducing and declining, again, we are looking at not only shark species extinction, but many other fish species extinction. And again, this is going to have absolutely catastrophic effects to the marine environment. And again, as I always say, without the marine environment being healthy, we don't have a chance of having a healthy land ecosystem. So what are two of the worst activities out on the ocean, or methods, practices? The two that I'm going to quickly touch on are longline fishing and bottom trawling. So longline fishing is when the boat will lay out hundreds of kilometers sometimes of line with regular hooks hanging from this line. Now, these hooks are completely indiscriminatory, which means that any animal can bite onto this hook. Each hook has sort of a bit of bait on, a bit of meat on. So many large predatory animals that are not the target, usually long-lining targets, game fish, swordfish, or tuna, any other animals can bite onto these hooks. And long-lining regularly catches thousands, hundreds of thousands of sharks, millions of sharks a year, turtles, seabirds, dolphins, and so many other fish species that are just not the target species. So it's extremely wasteful, as most of these animals are dead by the time they get pulled up on the boat. And then the other form of fishing, which is one of the most destructive practices on Earth, not just in fishing, this practice must be one of the most wasteful and damaging practices that we do. And this is bottom trawling. And this is where we get a huge net, sometimes over 100 meters wide and hundreds of meters long and deep, drop it to the bottom of the ocean, and then just drag it along the sea floor. This is the equivalent of using bulldozers to catch a squirrel in a forest. They just come along and they just drag that across the whole ecosystem in order to catch certain fish or animals, such as shrimps. Shrimps are regularly caught through bottom trawling or shrimp trawling. And this picks up huge amounts of other animals that are not the target species. You can see in the bottom right photo there, that is a shrimp trawl. You can see the sheer amount of other life that is in that net along with the shrimps. And sometimes bycatch, which is life that has been caught that isn't the target species, is up to 80 or even 90% of a bottom trawling net. So sometimes only 10% of the huge few tons of life that has been pulled up on this net, only about 10% is sometimes the actual target species, which is what is wanted from the fishing industry. So it's clear to see that these practices are massively damaging and are, like I mentioned, absolutely emptying the oceans. So we're going to watch a quick video now just to really give you a summary of the fishing industries. Now, this is about 15 years old now, but the same principles still apply and all these practices still happen.
As the demand for seafood increases, along with the fishing power of the global fleet, the question becomes, can the oceans keep up with the hunt? Many of the fish species we depend on are in serious trouble, and the situation is becoming more critical every day.
When you look at the oceans, they seem so vast that you think to yourself, how could people possibly fish out the oceans? I mean, the oceans cover much more of the Earth's surface than the land does. But most of the ocean is biologically a desert. The life is there, but it's very, very sparse. And where it's concentrated happens to be along the continents.
Few people realize the scale of the world fishing effort and what the industry must do to supply the ever-growing demand for seafood. But even in the most remote locations and in the deep waters of the open ocean, fish populations are being exhausted, one after another, by vessels using space-age tracking technology, dragging nets that sweep vast areas of ocean floor, and deploying miles and miles of baited hooks. The rate at which fish stocks are collapsing today is unprecedented, and the forces that give rise to this crisis are complex. Simply put, the fish cannot reproduce quickly enough to keep up with an ever-intensifying hunt, feeding an ever-growing human population. Each year, over 20 million metric tons of untargeted marine life, so-called bycatch, are discarded as waste, a volume equal to 4 times the entire catch of the U.S. fishing fleet. The amount of bycatch differs with each type of fishery, but among the worst are shrimp trawls. The mouth of the net is spread by the action of 2 heavy steel plates that drag along the bottom at either side. Vast areas of seafloor formerly inaccessible to fishing are now being trawled.
We've seen in areas that are chronically impacted by hundreds and hundreds of boats dragging nets and dredges all over the continental shelf, that a large percentage of the animals that make up the structures on the seafloor.
Today's longliners often deploy up to 60 miles of baited hooks. Thousands of these vessels now fish the world's oceans, landing millions of tons of tuna and swordfish every year. Sea turtles, considered endangered species worldwide, also fall victim to longline hooks. The long-term effects of this massive effort are beginning to show. Marine ecosystems, millions of years in the making, are being altered in ways that have never been seen.
I think fisheries and ocean ecosystems are in much greater trouble than is commonly appreciated. If we act in the relatively near future, we can turn some of those things around.
It really is very much up to us to decide. People shape the world. We can choose. There's a lot of potential to bring things back and have abundance and have beauty. And there's also a lot of risk right now.
We are at a crossroads. Whether or not we meet the challenges we face depends not only on fishermen and policymakers, but on each and every one of us, both as citizens and consumers.
All right, so that's obviously quite a depressing and upsetting video. So I want to finish on a much more positive note, which is how can we help? What can we do to turn this around and help save fish and shark species? Well, first of all, learn more about sharks. The more we learn about something, the more we care about it, the more that we're interested in it, and therefore the more we want to protect it and the more we can protect it as well. So learn more about sharks, and I'll talk to you in a second about what you can do to learn more about sharks, but that might be through documentaries, books, programs, courses, whatever. Just continue learning about sharks and the marine world. And then the next you can do is to encourage people, or to sort of reduce the fear and the misunderstanding around sharks. So talk about sharks in a positive way. If you hear people saying that they don't want to go swimming here or there because they're scared that there might be sharks in the water, explain to them how sharks don't see humans as a food source. And, you know, negative interactions with sharks happen so unbelievably rarely. It's, you know, there are many, many more risks around the world that people just sort of accept as daily life, and we don't really think about, that are much higher risk than being bitten by a shark. So try and spread positive information about sharks, and try and dispel any myths and sort of negative and misguided information that you might hear. And then finally, one of the most direct things you can do in order to help protect sharks and, like I said, other fish life, is to reduce or completely remove seafood from your diet. As I've mentioned, as you've seen, the fishing industry is hugely damaging to the ocean environment, and fish numbers are in a really, really bad way. So the best thing you can do is completely remove any seafood from your diet. If you do want to continue eating seafood, then that's fine, but please try and make sure that they are sustainably, the species or the fish that you're eating are sustainably caught. So caught using sustainable methods such as pole and line fishing, and that you are eating species that are not in decline. And there's some ways to do this. So you can check out the Marine Conservation Society's Good Fish Guide, keep up to date with that, see which species are recommended, what methods are recommended. But I would highly recommend at least reducing the amount of seafood in your diet, particularly things like prawns and shrimps that are bottom trawled. And if you can, completely remove seafood from your diet, or at least reduce it. All right, so to summarize, just to go over everything we've learned. First of all, sharks are so essential to the marine environment. They're so important to the ecosystem. They're important to other fish species. They're important to us on land. They really are a vital species that have been around for 400 million years, maintaining the health of the oceans. They are not the scary monster that everyone thinks that they are. They're in fact highly intelligent, usually very peaceful, very calm, amazing animals to see underwater, and they're at a huge risk of extinction. And therefore we must start protecting them and doing more in order to help and protect this group of amazing species. And the main thing that hopefully you're going to come away with today is that you can make a difference. Every act that you do, whether it is changing your diet to reduce your fish, whether it's talking more positively about sharks and informing one or two other people about how interesting and amazing sharks are, not that they're just this scary monster, or just the learning that you do yourself, all of this, if everyone does that and everyone starts to do that, it builds up and makes a huge impact and starts to change different people's ideas of sharks. So please do know that every small thing you can do does make an impact, because it multiplies upon itself as we spread the word and the information. So if you do want to learn more about sharks, then do follow me on any social medias. I'm as Ginge Under the Sea on Instagram and Facebook. I also have a YouTube channel. So you can learn loads more about sharks and conservation and fishing and what fish not to eat and to eat on my YouTube channel and my Instagrams. Also, I do talks similar to this for schools and organizations. So if you have someone in school that you think could really benefit from this, then do get in contact with me through Ginge Under the Sea, and I can give a talk and help educate more people about sharks and the marine world. And then there's some websites there that are really useful and give you even more information about all these different interesting features, like, you know, shark conservation and shark anatomy and all sorts. And then there's the seafood awareness websites at the bottom. If you do want to continue eating seafood, then please use those websites to at least guide you on what the best options are. So finally, if you do want to learn more about sharks, I have just released a brand new online shark course in collaboration with Udemy and Shark Guardian. It's on all the links in my social medias. So if you are interested in learning about sharks and you love to do an online course and study and have lectures and have quizzes and, you know, worksheets and things like that, then this is the perfect course for you to learn more about anatomy, physiology, evolution, conservation, identification, all sorts of stuff. It's all packed in this awesome course that pretty much encompasses everything you'd need to know about sharks. So like I said, if you do want to find out more about that, go to my social medias. You'll easily be able to find the link there. And then finally, like I mentioned, there is my YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much for joining today on this awesome day of Quest 79. I hope you've enjoyed my talk, and I hope you enjoy any of the other exciting activities or quests that are going on throughout the day. And thank you so much for joining me on my quest.